Welcome to this narrated PowerPoint on the subject of history around us, and of course our chosen site is Ludlow Castle. This is paper 2. It's in our exam and makes up 20% of the total for the GCSE. So when you have a look at the exam paper, you'll have 3 questions to choose from. They're all 20 marks. There are 3 questions to choose from, and you'll have a choice of 2 of those questions. For high marks in this paper, you need to show strong knowledge of the past, you need to have understanding of it, and you need to have clear, appropriate understanding of secondary order concepts. By that we're referring to complexity really, so that's things like turning points and change and how typical things are. Complexity is the simplest way of looking at that. You also need to show an understanding of a range of specific appropriate features of the site and of the sources of the site as well, and forming a consistent, plausible, well substantiated answer. So we've got those 3 main questions, so it's not a bad thing always to think about which two of those first 3 questions you would actually choose. Let's go through them then. So the first question really is focused on this idea of a turning point. And for Ludlow Castle, we're spoiled for choice really for Ludlow Castle, but one of the best choices you might have would be when Ludlow Castle changes firstly from a Norman fortress to a fortified palace. But the better turning point really, because it's easier to focus on, is when Ludlow Castle turns from a fortified palace to an admin centre, because that really is a clear change. So our turning point is likely to be that focus that we're going to look at and why it happens. And of course it's part of the way the castle falls into royal hands at this time. Challenges when the castle was first created. We're looking at the fact that the North Range was built. We don't know what was underneath it. We're looking at changes that happened, and the way that we're getting around that is through archaeology. So it says how we would overcome these challenges. Sorry, the word overcome is missing there. We're looking at archaeology, and we're looking at understanding and linking it to historical events, because it's through understanding those historical events, such as the anarchy, that we can link changes in the castle and understand why those happened. Painting of life at the site of the castle, or part of the site. What you tell the artist, look at, first of all you need to change which site you're looking at. So again, you might give the admin centre and the judges and the lawyers that we're looking at, or you might give the fortified palace and they're looking at the lords and the servants that would be around, and the various different types of servants and different type levels that they're doing and what they might be doing to explain that. First, these PowerPoint questions, just extra questions to consider. One important change in the way that your site was used is very similar to the first question in terms of the turning point. Specific features in the physical remains at your site reveal about the similarities and differences between it and other sites you've studied. That's Chepstow Castle we're going to look at, and Chepstow Castle is featured at the end of this PowerPoint. One period in your site's history, explain how and why the site is significant, help us understand historians' inquiries into everyday life, attitudes and values of that period. So we need to just choose a period. We could choose any of the 3, Norman fortress or fortified palace, or we could do the admin centre, the council of the marches, and we're explaining the different types of people who were involved, different attitudes between those different people, and what that tells us about the period. Any of those 3 periods would be relevant. Just before we go any further, let's have a look at the overview of the site. So the picture on the left hand side there gives you the overview of the whole building. We've got the outer bailey and the inner bailey. And we know that one of our issues is going to be this North Range that was constructed. We don't know what was constructed underneath it. we don't know exactly what was there. We got the chapel here, we got the innermost bailey, and then we got the judges' lodgings on this side here. Then we got these buildings, which were so misunderstood when they were first created. This confusing walkway that goes through the castle on this side actually goes into the outer bailey. It causes us some issues for understanding it. And on the right hand side, we got an image of the inner bailey. And these notes down here will give you some of the major buildings that you will certainly need to be talking about during any question that you take on Ludlow Castle. Particular things of note: I've mentioned the North Range and how difficult it is to understand what occurred there. We've also got the changes to the north wall of the Great Keep as well, and things like the entranceway changing as well from its original position to this position here. Again, other things to discuss for difficulty for historians, but the change in this area here, which is the walkway that was constructed to the chapel. Where was it built? What level was it? What did it look like? Again, questions for historians, which we can answer partly through archaeology and partly through understanding the history at the time. So let's have a look at the castle in its origin, the site on which the castle was built. So it was part of the Norman conquest. It came fairly late as part of the Norman conquest. The Marches area was unsettled, so that explains why it wasn't built to them. We had the uprising of Edric the Wild, 1069 to 1070, and it would have been after this period when there was a little bit of peace, when there was a little bit of stability in the area, that Ludlow Castle would have been built to try to maintain that peace, maintain control over the Wild Welsh. It was built as part of the tranche of castles that were built by William Fitzosborne, the first Earl of Hereford. He's also responsible for Chepstow Castle, Wigmore Castle, which is a castle that we'll come back to. Probably built around 1085. Doesn't feature in the 1086 Domesday Book, but then the Domesday Book was designed to tell William what was taxable features at this time, and Ludlow Castle as a tool of the crown wouldn't have been included in that. But we can clearly see during this early period that there's a whole load of castles that are built in this Marches area, a part of the three earldoms to try to become Wales. Two major roads were built in this area: Watling Street to the west of Ludlow, joining up with Chester, and then the second road, not really sure the exact origins of this road, but it was thought to run from Gloucester to Ashton, crossed Ludford, not a bridge, but it would have been a ford, hence the name, and probably holds the modern line of where Old Street and Court Street lie. Ludlow Castle, it's clear when you stand down the linear and you look up, it was built in a curve in the River Team, 100-foot cliffs on three sides. Stone from Wycliffe was initially used to build the castle. There were settlements in the local area, but not many really. There was a fairly substantial building at Bromfield and at Stanton Lacey. There is the previous camp, Iron Age fort at Cadenham Camp, and there were minor settlements at Dinham, which probably gave its name to the castle originally, and at Linney, which might explain why the road has that's uncommon changes in it, probably to fit in with farm buildings around that area. So Norman fortress, 1080 to 1280, roughly in terms of that period. So the original castle in this image here, we've got the original gatehouse and the four towers, which weren't as high, none of which were as high as they now are. We've got the moat or a ditch, which would have been much more substantial than it looks today. Then during the changes of the anarchy, we've got the entrance being moved, probably for just to make it easier to get goods into the castle. We've got the Chapel of Mary Magdalene would have been built by this point, probably inspired by buildings of the same circular type built in Jerusalem, marking the circular chapel were very popular at the time. A curtain wall was built up, so we've got the outer bailey being built up. Obviously, it only shows part out there, but we can see the outer bailey in this image down here. And the keep would have increased in size, so it add layers to it. Then in the 1260s, again with potential local rivalry still going ahead, the Gennevilles or the Joinvilles would have added to the castle. We've got the innermost bailey, so that's this area being constructed. We've got the great kitchen being formed at this point. We've got the postern tower and the western tower being built up and made taller at this point, so greater defences. So it would have been more adding more strength at this point. And we've also got Mortimer's Tower just here on the curtain wall, and that in itself causes issue because the original historians didn't recognise that this was also a gatehouse as well. Let's move quickly onto the fortified palace. We've got this is where the North Range really starts building up. We don't know we don't know about this area here really, this part of the North Range. But in this part, where I've drawn the line with the Solar Lock and the Great Hall, as it turns into that fortified palatial look for the castle. So it's these buildings here which really give it its look. And then in the 1320s, under Mortimer, we've got the Great Chamber Block. And in celebration of his escape, of Mortimer's escape from the Tower of London, we've got Chapel of St. Peter as well. So those were extra buildings that were created and again added to the palatial feel of this place. Admin centre, we got the Tudor lodgings being built over here. We got the judges' lodgings being built on the outside. So there's these buildings here. The Porter's Lodge to welcome people into the Outer Bailey. The prison as well in the building next to it. And on top of the St. Peter's Chapel, we've got a first floor being added. And then in the Romantic ruin, we've got the castle really falling into decay. We've got the castle house being built in this area just here. But the story of the Romantic ruin after 1689, after the change of monarchs of the Glorious Revolution, we've got the castle losing its centralised look and really running into disrepair. So going back to the Norman fortress, 3 phases to this. The original phase in 1080s with the gatehouse and the 4 towers, and then it's building up of its defences, plus the Chapel of St. Mary Magdalene. Remember that chapel, although it's religious, it really is linked to war because it's all about getting God on your side and giving glory to God as well. The curtain wall being built up as well. And then we got the innermost bailey, Mortimer's Tower, and the building up of these towers on this western side just to add to the defences during this time period. So the history of the Norman fortress. So during the Norman conquest of England, Earl of Hereford, William Fitzosborne, was tasked with settling the area, and his second in command was Walter de Lacy, who began building the castle within the manor that he owned in Stanton Lacy already. So that's where the castle came from. We know that the castle's original purpose was to fight against the Welsh, and there's evidence of this in the fact that one of the early lords of the castle, King Fitzjohn, died in 1137, chasing down a Welsh raiding party. Now, a key part of this period is the period known as the Anarchy, a civil war contested between King Stephen and the Empress Matilda, in which not only was that a major battle on a nationwide scale, we also have a series of battles that occur all over. And it's said at this time all the saints of England left England. It's a time of great chaos, hence the name the Anarchy. Now at this point, Gilbert de Lacy rose up against Stephen, who had married one of his knights, Jos de Dinan, to Sybil, who was Gilbert's cousin, and gave the castle to Jos de Dinan. Stephen took the castle after several attempts, which included a very famous occurrence where he rescued his ally, the Prince of Scotland, Henry, who was caught on hook from the castle walls. Gilbert retook the castle, and in the interim, it seems that Gilbert was held prisoner. Now, this is where we got some dispute, because according to some local records, Gilbert was held prisoner in the castle and may have just been released after payment of a fine. However, we've got the romance of Fulk Fitzwarren telling a very different story, perhaps very much romanticised story, whereby Gilbert de Lacy, who in the story is seemingly misnamed Walter de Lacy, is captured and is held in the castle along with one of his men. Marion de la Bruere is a lady within the castle who falls in love with Gilbert de Lacy, or Walter de Lacy as it's named, his attendant, helps them to escape, and then one day helps them back into the castle and allows them to take the castle themselves. Marion Bruere realises what she's done. She commits suicide, jumps from the Pendover Castle, and her ghost is said to roam around. We don't know how true that story is. We don't know how true it was, but it seems that during this period, that is Gilbert de Lacy retaking the castle. And this is one of the difficulties of getting to the truth about what went on. In terms of historical importance, the anarchy, a time of great turmoil, time of attacks, we can date the increasing of the walls of the keep and of some of the towers. It makes sense for that to have happened during this period of time. The curtain wall to be established, perhaps, and for the keep to be built up. Other examples. Lords of Ludlow Castle took part in other issues at the time. So we have Hugh de Lacy taking part in the Norman invasion and having his castle confiscated in his absence. We got Prince John's rebellion. Walter actually fought against Prince John, but had his land confiscated for doing so, maybe as an excuse for the king to make sure he kept him where he wanted. And then we have Henry III meeting with the Welsh Prince Llewellyn ap Iorwerth in Ludlow Castle for unsuccessful peace talks. So there we have in Ireland, we have internal dispute between brothers, and we have meeting of the rebel Welsh as well. Another major part, though, is the Second Barons' War, when the rebel leader Simon de Montfort, who for a long time was very successful, seized Ludlow Castle, but it was captured shortly afterwards by one of Henry's supporters, probably led by Geoffrey de Jonville. Prince Edward escaped from captivity, being held in Hereford, met up with supporters at the castle, and that they gathered their supporters there, and that led to de Montfort's defeat at Evesham. De Jonville was responsible for increasing the height of the towers. He created the tower that was later known as Mortimer's Tower, though that's slightly anachronistic, and he created the innermost bailey. So, not surprisingly, again, archaeological evidence gives us evidence for those buildings, but we can date it to, first of all, the spending that was done during these times, but also it makes sense that after the Second Barons' War, that Jonville would look to fortify the castle. And this is also a time period when the town walls were constructed. Okay, let's have a look at a little bit of life in the Norman fortress, and a large part of these will also apply to the fortified castle as well, the fortified palace. So we've got various different people in charge. We've got the constable and the steward who were in charge of the castle in the absence. The steward ran the castle. We got the marshal, who was in charge of all the different parts of the household, including the farrier's grooms, anything that was linked to military and transporting goods. Then we've got military issues itself. We've got knights, we got their squires, the boys who are training to be knights. So we would expect those at Ludlow Castle during this time period as its Norman fortress. And then we've got the other side of things. We've got caring for the lord and the lady. So we've got the butler in charge of the cellar and wine and the beer. We've got a chamberlain, personal finances, and the chaplain, of course, to take care of the chapel, supervising the clerk, and also supervising accounts. Minstrels are a part of the entertainment. We've got the master mason, of course, lots of building work, so we'd expect a master mason to be around looking at the changes and overseeing the changes. And then we got maybe some lesser ones, the porter in charge of the door, the blacksmith, making sure the weapons were ready, making sure the horses were fully supplied. Carters bringing wood and stone, and again, that focus on the construction. We mentioned some of these earlier. It's very difficult to now see Ludlow Castle, those trees that have been deliberately grown later to soften the very view of it. One of the Roman roads has disappeared, it's not mentioned in the Domesday Book. Most of our accounts come from archaeology and contemporary accounts at the time, written accounts. We link these very much to the anarchy and to the Second Barons' War I mentioned earlier. We know that the curtain wall was created where the main entrance was moved as shown by that red circle there, and that's very clear to see, probably to provide a more convenient entrance to the castle. The north wall of the keep was knocked down and rebuilt, and we don't know exactly when that was, because we don't know exactly why that was. We don't know if it was undermined, we don't know if it was poorly built, we don't know if it took place during the anarchy. We can roughly group it to that sort of time. It certainly would have been linked to the fortification. That makes sense, therefore, to link it to the period of the anarchy when the strengthening of the castle took place. We can't be precise about the Chapel of Mary Magdalene, but based on the evidence we got, we can certainly link that to the De Lacys. I mentioned earlier there's the dispute between the romancer Fog Fitzwarren, but that artistic license and how much is true itself. And we do know that early 20th century historians Clark and St John Hope didn't see originally the gate because the Port Castle and the gas gate rebates obscured from view. Now you go in there now and it's easy to see, but that wasn't necessarily the case at the time. So all those give us some difficulties. The key thing here is we're linking it to historical events. We're looking at the records, the financial records. We're looking at similar castles like Chepstow Castle and how it changed there. We can't be precise, but we can be fairly sure about the time periods that we're looking at. Right, we now move on to the fortified palace. Now this clearly is a turning point between what occurred before, between the Norman fortress and now. However, I don't think it's really, I wouldn't see it necessarily as the biggest turning point, but we do get this whole of this North Range being created, and we don't know what was under that period. We got the Mortimers. Well, Mortimers already existed, but we now have the Mortimers in charge, and we have St Peter's Chapel being created just here as well. So the major thing is those changes to the Great North Range. First of all, the solar block and the Great Hall, 14 and 13, as marked on the map there. And then we've got the Great Chamber block further along. And we've got the Garderobe Tower on the outside of the castle, providing great luxury for a new type of guest again here. But as I said, we've got the Chapel of St Peter. So the first ones are doing the de Jonville, and then during the Mortimers below. And we can tie that clearly to historical events. So, history of the fortified palace. Well, after defeating Simon de Montfort, we get de Jonville overseeing a long period of peace, and this would have allowed him to beautify, to gentrify, to make the castle somewhere of greater luxury. And that's where we get the Great Hall and the solar block. Then, later periods, Roger Mortimer found himself, first of all, on the Luton side of the Despencer Wall. He was locked up in the Tower of London by Edward II. He escaped from there and formed an alliance with the estranged Queen Isabella. They formed more than an alliance, they were in a relationship together. And he seized power in 1327. And it was probably de Montfort who was responsible for Edward II being murdered horribly in a death reported to include a red-hot poker. And in a very uncomfortable place. And Mortimer becomes very powerful, the Earl of March. In honour of his escape, he built St Peter's Chapel. He adds the Great Chamber block, greater luxury, the garderobe showing off tower there with the ensuite rooms on the outside of the castle. And the historian Whitehead has turned this a show castle. That's a very useful phrase for you to use in your essays. Now, he's effectively the King of England, however, only lasts for about 3 years before Edward III, Edward II's son, rises up and he's executed. Further events during this time period: Roger Mortimer, the 2nd of March, is in the 100 Years' War, so again he's involved in a major issue. We get further issues with the Welsh, and that's going to carry on into the Council of the Marches. The display of rebel Grown Ap Tudor on the town gates facing Wales as a warning to others. And then we got a rebellion by Owen Glyndwr, which is taken on by Edmund Mortimer, but he's captured and isn't allowed to be ransomed, and eventually marries Glyndwr's daughters before dying during the siege of Harlech Castle by the future Henry V at that point in 1409. We get Ludlow's very much beautified, and this is a key change here because now the castle falls into the hands of Richard, Duke of York. Now he's going to be really important because it will be his son who becomes king eventually after the Wars of the Roses, and that changes the castle's ownership. So Richard, Duke of York, is responsible for the great bell tower, St. Lawrence's Church, and the stained glass windows. We now get the Wars of the Roses. There's the Battle of Ludford Bridge, in which Richard of York and his son flee from Mortimer's Tower after the skirmish, leaving the rest of the family in the castle, mind you. Henry VI is victorious there, but Edward IV seizes the throne in 1461. So Richard of York's son seizes the throne. He gathers his forces at Ludlow and Wigmore and defeats the Lancashire force at the nearby Battle of Mortimer's Cross. He takes control of Ludlow Castle, and crucially, he merges it with the property of the Crown, and that's going to be really important for what follows. Now, similar sort of life to what we saw occurring before. Bailiff in charge of jobs. We've got the butler, we've got Ura, so we got people more in charge of luxury, falconer, keeper of the wardrobe, and making sure that the wardrobes are kept immaculately. Lots of messengers. We'll still have watchmen, of course. We might still have some knights and some footmen. But the castle still is very much fortified. But as you can tell by the name, it is a palace as well. It's for showing off. Problems. Well, we mentioned this. The Great North Range has been built, and we don't know what occurred there. What's below it? We don't know what was there before. So the solar block, the Great Hall, the Great Chamber, Garden Road Tower. We know they're there, but it's now difficult to understand what was there before. Contemporary accounts refer to them, and we know there would have been something of a great hall as there was at places like Chepstow. There's the Wigmore Chronicle, also claims that Roger Mortimer entertained King Edward III at Ludlow and at Wigmore, but there's no evidence that this actually happened, so we don't know if this was a case of showing off or it was planned to happen and it didn't happen. As always, the North Range, it makes it difficult to understand those original castle defences because the situation has changed. But we have models, we have recreations, we have archaeological evidence, and we know of the dates. But we know of what the buildings were and when they were spent. If they were the period, we can't be sure of the exact date. Move on now then to the administrative centre, the Council of the Marches. And this clearly is a major change, and it's all to do with that the castle coming into the hands of the royal family and them deciding that they'll be the way they would control Wales through this way. So we have the Tudor lodgings just here. We have the judges' lodgings suiting the change to the castle. We got the porter's lodge, and we've got the prison, and probably a brewery somewhere in the innermost bailey, and St. Peter's Chapel would have had in the outer bailey, St. Peter's Chapel on the first floor. There would have been a courtroom, again befitting the change that's occurred at this period. So Council of the Marches, to begin with, was first established in 1472, and it was a body to advise him. That's what its original function was. But as time goes on, we see that slightly change. So we have the future Edward V and his brother Prince Richard. known as the Prince of the Tower, lived in Ludlow Castle before being called to London by their uncle Richard III, and they disappear from public view at that point. Henry VIII gives Ludlow Castle to his oldest son, Prince Arthur, the older brother of the future Henry VIII, and he reestablishes the dormant Council of the Marches at the property. Council of Wales and the Marches were a regional body, and it controls Wales and the surrounding English counties. So it's a really quite a powerful body as well. We've got royalty now. We had important lords before. Now we've got royalty. So Prince Arthur honeymoons in Ludlow Castle with his bride Catherine of Aragon, and we've got Aragon's restaurant is named after Catherine of Aragon. And we've also got the building next to the Buttery, which is supposedly where she lived as well. They supposedly stayed in an upper room of the solar block, but he died. His heart was supposedly buried in St Lawrence's Church, but his body was buried in Worcester. Mary Tudor stayed as part of her time overseeing the Council of the Marches, and St Mary's Walk is the area that we walk to, just with the entrance where you walk through the Outer Bailey without going into the castle, and out by the front of the Mortimer's Tower. We get the increasing power of the council. 1534, Roland Lee's leadership said all thieves in Wales quake with fear. His way of doing it was he'd have a public hanging on market day to show out all the thieves, don't mess with me. And then you go to the scaffold, trussed in a sack, to teach them a lesson. Officially, the Act of Union, using justice of the peace, greatly increases the power of the Council of the Marches. But the biggest and most powerful time for the Ludlow Castle is probably under Sir Henry Sidney, president of the council. He extends the castle, spends an awful lot of money on the castle. He builds family apartments between the Great Hall and the Mortimer's Tower. The larger windows are become glazed, the clocks installed, water piped into the castle. We get the courthouse converted from the top of St Peter's Chapel during this time period, and the upper floor of St Peter's Chapel is used for prisoners and for storage facilities as well. This restoration, the showing off period, included a fountain, real tennis courts, walks, and a viewing platform as well. And we also get this period where we get this change to chapel too. So an example of how rich it's become. 13 shillings 4pence was spent on musicians and 40 shillings on a company called the Queen's Players. We get the first ever performance of Milton's Comus at considerable expense, and then we get the change. The English Civil War in 1642 occurs. There's a royalist garrison. Ludlow is loyal to the king. Of course, they're unsuccessful. And in 1646, a parliamentary army comes from Hereford, surrounds Ludlow. There's a short siege, and supposedly, if you got onto Wycliffe, the walk over the top, you can see those trenches there. That's supposedly where the parliamentary army dug those trenches, ready to besiege the castle. Sensibly, the castle and the town surrendered, which means Ludlow Castle wasn't slighted, it wasn't destroyed. Now, they do succeed, they survived the English Civil War, but it doesn't last long. Cromwell reigns for a while, but then we get the Restoration and the Glorious Revolution in 1689, realise that the monarchy can't control things in such a way anymore. So Council of Marches isn't re-established, and it's finally disbanded in 1689, which brings an end to Ludlow Castle's role in government. Because we've got glass, we have wood now, glaziers. This is the key though. We've got judges and we've got attorneys and we've got clerks, keeping records, judging accounts, seeing prisoners, deciding cases. We've got an awful lot of admin going on. The Great Hall central hearth, it originally was in the centre. If you go into R5, just mark on this in the Great Hall. If you mark on this, originally there was a sort of fireplace marking in the middle, and there would have been a chimney to go to the top of it. Now we get a major fireplace being built there as well. And a 1650 inventory shows you those various different rooms in the North Range. So with drawing room, chamber, several chambers, given specific names. So it really is, it's very much changed its focus. There's no sense of military. It's not a castle for military purposes anymore. the whole change to this period means we got bigger windows, we've got glazing. Tudor lodgings and Judge lodgings again interfere with our understanding of it. There would have been, outside the original gatehouse, there would have been a barbican, but Sir Henry Sidney knocked this down and built a large stone bridge and then filled the ditch. So the ditch would have been much deeper originally, and there would have been a barbican outside, walls outside it, and there's no record of that anymore because Sir Henry Sidney got rid of them because it was no longer a military castle. We don't know exactly what happened with the Chapel of St Mary Magdalene. Archaeological evidence suggests there was, and if you go to the castle, you can see that a link between the chapel and the great chamber block from the north window, probably during the time of Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon, although that is disputed. So again, we know it happened, we just don't know exactly when, and there were mistakes originally made. They thought they were all stables, but then we now know where those stables were. There was a porter's lodge and a prison, because we've got an inventory from the prison detailing how the prisoners should be treated. So there's a bit of written evidence backing up the archaeological evidence as well. Right, finally we get to the Romantic ruin, the castle that we know from today, which slowly declined from 1689 onwards. So it was abandoned. William and Mary centralised control of the whole of England and Wales. It was known by 1722 already. It was known as a castle, as very perfection of decay. The Parishes, who currently control the castle, were first involved in 1771, approached the crown about leasing it. They described it as extremely ruinous, mostly rubble, and the battlements are greatly decayed. His wife constructed the public walks we now see around the castle and dug into the surrounding cliffs, which of course obscures our understanding of how that military and how deliberately was set up for defence originally. Became really fashionable, became really well known. Painters such as J.M.W. Turner and William Marlowe painted it. Paris offered to buy the castle outright this time and did so in 1811. They converted the abandoned tennis court and the castle into a new grand building called the Castle House, which is where you will find the tea rooms today. With the rail network being constructed, Ludlow was connected to it, and we get increased amounts of tourists now start coming to the castle. And that continues in the 1920s and 1930s in motor transport. It's used during the Allied military in World War II. We've got images of it being used for a baseball game. 21st century, it's owned by the Earl of Paris, but managed by the trustees of the Paris Castle Estate as a tourist attraction. It still features in the Ludlow Food and Drink Festival and the Medieval Fair, and the English Heritage website calls it one of England's finest castle sites. This is a key bit for us: remarkably complete multi-phase complex, and that's why Ludlow Castle really is a good phase feature you're looking at for this unit, apart from, of course, it being the reason why we have the town of Ludlow in the first place. There are problems. We mentioned these, the paths. They cut through the Outer Bailey. You can see that in this image here of the castle. So that just wouldn't exist beforehand. These paths, they get rid of the very steep originally incline up to the castle. We can still work it out because of archaeological evidence. It's just difficult for us to potentially imagine. We use remodels to create a sense of the original site. So let's just recap again. This is your Norman fortress, very much military. We've got, of course, the chapel, but apart from that, everything else, including those changes under the Joinvilles, were very much a military change. Fortified palace, we get under the Joinville, the change to because of that period of peace, we get the solar block and the Great Hall, and then under the de facto king, really, under Morton, we get the Great Chamber block, the Guards Tower, and the Chapel of St Peter being built. Now, this is a significant change, a significant turning point, because under the ownership of the Crown, it now becomes an administrative centre and the Council of the Marches. And that really is the way the castle's now geared up, very, very much so, in terms of admin, in terms of justice, in terms of courts. That's the focus. It's not really a defensive castle anymore. And then the castle goes into decline in this final period. We just see there's that confusing change to the walls going inside the Outer Bailey, and we've got Castle House just here as well. So we've reserved the final part of this PowerPoint to have a look at the differences between Ludlow Castle and a similar castle, albeit one that was built a bit earlier and was more important military to begin with. So Chepstow Castle, further to the south. Now there are quite a lot of similarities between the castles. You can see them highlighted on the PowerPoint there. Again, Chepstow Castle is built on cliffs. The Earl of Hereford, William Fitzosborne, was responsible for it. It was again part of that chain of castles that surrounded Welsh and to deal with the Welsh. Like Ludlow, there was no evidence of a settlement before the castle was there before. This settlement of the town of Chepstow came later, and it was an important crossing point in the river and part of communications in Monmouth and Hereford, a bit like Ludlow was further north to Chester and to Shrewsbury. So there we go, we've got Ludlow Castle here in the map, central Wales, and Chepstow Castle down here, southern area. But there's a lot of similarities between the two, and you can see again they're both on cliffs and they're both in a bend in the river as well. So we've tried to make it a similarity, a comparison here between the different periods of the castle, and at this point they're still fairly similar to each other. So we have Ludlow Castle as a Norman fortress. We've got a great tower, a great tower built in Chepstow, and of course you will notice, because we've got slopes to this side of Chepstow Castle and we've got the cliffs to this side, we've got a different shape to Chepstow Castle, but other than that they're fairly similar. The initial fortifications were extended and modernised. Now the military importance of Chepstow is more important. It was built earlier. It was a show of strength by William at the start of this period. He strengthened the defences in the centre, the middle part of it, and later on, as we'll come to now, the southern and the northern parts as well. So the shape's different, but we've still got towers. We've got a slightly different keep. Ludlow's keep, as we know, is actually part of the Inner Bailey, whilst the keep at Chepstow, well, it's close to it, but it's more central. We can see at Chepstow. Worth noting the range of activities. A constable steward marked on the left there. They would have been similar in both castles. In fact, we can rely on Chepstow Castle for its notifications to inform us what happened at Ludlow. So here we have the period that for Ludlow we're calling the show castle, a fortified palace. Now there was certainly an awful lot of building work at Chepstow, quite a substantial change there between the castle that we saw earlier. So the changes at Chepstow Castle have come quicker, they come earlier, and they are certainly more defensive, and that's because of its position, and that's because Chepstow Castle was part of the major attacks by King Edward for his attack on Wales. So we've got similar buildings. A town wall was completed in this time as well. But whilst Ludlow's moving towards being a show castle because of its type of ownership, Chepstow's still staying. Yes, there's a show castle aspect of it, but it's very, very much more military than Ludlow. It's got a very important military base. Particularly, it's apologies for the fact that they're not really shown on here, but we have the Morton's Tower to this side of the castle. Really steadfast defences have been created here. And they even talking about placing catapults and siege engines on top of the towers. We've got barbicans and portcullises all the way through these different areas. We've got another gatehouse here. So we've got several gatehouses, much more military. Of course, it's showing off, but whilst Ludlow's focus is on this north range and things like the Garderobe Tower, the change at Chepstow is it's built up, but stayed a military focus. However, we're now going to see a major change between the two castles, because after 1300 they would the first have been successful in conquering Wales, and therefore what we're going to see in the next phase is Ludlow takes on a new world, a new phase, which makes it pretty unique as a castle. Chepstow follows the reign of many of the castles of this time period and loses its raison d'etre, which is as a military force. So here we can see it, no change in Chepstow. In fact, if anything, we can't really see it there, but it's become private accommodation as with the first conquest of Wales has happened. And in fact, the laws which governed and led to the importance in Wales that led to Ludlow becoming more important actually lead to Chepstow becoming less important. So it is now very much a place, a house for occupation, as a dwelling rather than as a castle. Ludlow, of course, totally different. It's gone to royal hands. Those lords by the Wales have actually made Ludlow really important. It's an administrative centre. We've got members of the royal family. We've got judges, lawyers, clerks, Sir Henry Sidney, all those changes and all these things that are happening here. The judges' lodgings, the Tudor lodgings, the porter's lodge, they're very, very much different. This is where Ludlow is really quite unique, and there won't be many other castles, if any other castles in England which follow, or in Britain, which follow this route. Now, we can see there's some similarity because they both are affected by the Civil War. They're both attacked by parliamentarians, they're both besieged, and they both fall. But again, whilst Ludlow Castle is pretty much left, because of its military basis, Chepstow is kept as a parliamentary, as a basis, as it's garrisoned as a military artillery fort, and it's also used as a prison again because of that same reason. And both castles have a similar outlook again now. They come back together. Ludlow Castle, perhaps more famous, very Perfection Decay with Daniel Defoe, but we have it becomes a very key part of the Wye Valley, the Wye Tour, the pleasure boats going down the river, looking at the castle, and they both come into ownership now. Ludlow goes into ownership of the Earl of Powys, and from there it is used as a tourist attraction. It's more controlled by the government for Chepstow. It's controlled by Cadwra, the Welsh government body, but they both are restored for the public. They both become tourist destinations, and they both hold special events. So we've got those three main questions. So it's not a bad thing always to think about which two of those first three questions you would actually choose. Let's go through them then. So the first question really is focused on this idea of a turning point. And for Ludlow Castle, well, we're spoiled for choice really for Ludlow Castle, but one of the best choices you might have would be when Ludlow Castle changes firstly from a Norman fortress to a fortified palace. But the better turning point really, because it's easier to focus on, is when Ludlow Castle turns from a fortified palace to an admin centre, because that really is a clear change. So our turning point is likely to be that focus that we're going to look at and why it happens. And of course it's part of the way the castle falls into royal hands at this time. Challenges when the castle was first created. We're looking at the fact that the North Range was built. We don't know what was underneath it. We're looking at changes that happened, and the way that we're getting around that is through archaeology. So it says how we would someone overcome these challenges. Sorry, the word overcome is missing there. We're looking at archaeology, and we're looking at understanding and linking it to historical events, because it's through understanding those historical events, such as the anarchy, that we can link changes in the castle and understand why those happened. Painting of life at the site of the castle, or part of the site. What would you tell the artist to look at? Well, you first of all need to change which site you're looking at. So again, you might have the admin centre and the judges and the lawyers that we're looking at, or you might go for the fortified palace and then looking at the lords and the servants that would be around, and the various different types of servants and different type levels that they're doing and what they might be doing to explain that. Firstly, these powerful questions, just extra questions to consider. One important change in the way that your site was used is very similar to the first question in terms of the turning point. Specific features in the physical remains at your site reveal about the similarities and differences between it and other sites you've studied. That's Chepstow Castle we're going to look at, and Chepstow Castle is featured at the end of this PowerPoint. One period in your site's history, explain how and why the site is significant, help us understand the historian's inquiries into everyday life, attitudes and values of that period. So we need to just choose a period. We could choose any of the three, Norman Fortress or Fortified Palace, or we could do the admin centre, the Council of the Marches, and we're explaining the different types of people who were involved, different attitudes between those different people, and what that tells us about the period. Any of those three periods would be relevant.